Hello and welcome to our very important lecture today, where we will be discussing the concept of peak bone mass, and then we will be discussing the tissue structure and function of our bone. So, this bone tissue is very important because our bones represent reservoir of minerals that help us maintain calcium homeostasis and phosphate homeostasis. And our bone carrying this bone marrow is where we have our progenitors for making, the red blood cells for hematopoiesis and our white blood cells. This bone tissue is very important because it provides structural support, and it mediates and transfers this mechanical movement from the muscles. So the muscles pull on our bones to provide us with the energy to move. So these mechanical vibrations from our muscles help are mediated by our bone, and that helps us move from one place to another. Also, the bone is like a protective capsule. So we keep the money inside the safe. So our brain is our brain is encapsulated and covered by the cranium. So the bone is a structural a support and protection, provides structural protection for our bone from trauma. And also the rib cage provides structural support and protection for our heart and our lungs. So bones are very important, and they mediate many functions. So we will be talking about this bone remodeling. So our bones are seemingly in a steady state. They are seemingly stable. But in fact, that is not true. There are, on the level of microscopic, at the microscopic level, there is constant remodeling. There's constant remodeling. There is a tussle between the osteoclast and the osteoblast. Today, we will also talk about the different types of cells in our bone. We have osteoblasts and osteoclast and osteocytes. What's the difference between osteoblast and osteoclast and osteocytes? And then we will also talk about the biochemical pathways that mediate the process of bone buildup and bone resorption, bone density and bone destruction. So osteoclasts mediate bone degradation because they have acid, and they have these hydrolytic and proteolytic enzymes with these metalloproteinases. These proteolytic enzymes degrade the bone. So osteoclasts, whenever they are activated, when osteoclasts are activated, they resorb and destroy the bone. And that makes sense in situations where there is hypocalcemia, where there's an overall drop in calcium levels in our body. So it makes sense to turn on now the osteoclast to go to the bone that happens to be a reservoir, a big bank of um, we have blood bank, but we also have calcium bank, and that happens to be the bone. So the osteoclast will degrade the bone and start to deplete bones from to deplete calcium from the bone tissue to enrich our blood. So there's movement from of calcium from our bone into our blood, and that will bring up this drop in calcium in our blood back to homeostatic level. Well, we don't want that to happen excessively, and that would be the case of osteoporosis. In osteoporosis, there is an overall excessive degradation of our bone. There is overall excessive activation of osteoclasts. So for now, you must understand that osteoclasts mediate the breakage and the bone resorption. The opposite of osteoblast from blast, they add up, they build up the bone. So osteoblasts increase the bone density, And osteocytes, they are like a computer. They report to the nervous system the homeostatic level of our bone. If our bone is too depleted of calcium, if our bone is too weak, the osteocytes, the computers, they will integrate that information and send a stressful stimuli to our nervous system saying, hey, we have a weak bone. We need to stop osteoclast and initiate osteoblast, and vice versa. If in the case of osteopetrosis, where we have excessive marble bone disease, we have excessive buildup of excessive tissue, where the bone becomes really too dense, then the osteocytes will report to the nervous system that, hey, we need to stop, we need to block this osteoblast activity, and we need to initiate some osteoclast activity. So that will make more sense as we go on. And then we will talk about the different factors that influence peak bone mass, and that is exercise. So when we're exercising, especially resistance exercise, so if you want to build up really strong bone, if you want to make your bone really dense, you're better off lifting weights rather than being on the bicycle. So we're load cycle is really um, not as effective as resistance load. So you are exposing your bone to lifting different weights that will induce osteoblast activity to cope with this stress of having to lift this very heavy weights, rather than being on a bicycle, and that is just a process of just lactic acid and ensuring that you have the endurance. So this is, so being on a bicycle is not going to make your bones as strong as they would be when you're lifting weights. So physical exercise is very important to develop peak bone mass. And there are also genetic factors, because there are some congenital diseases where there are mutations that induce excessive osteocyte activity. There are other genetic factors that induce um, excessive bone deposition. And then there are, nutritional factors. For example, many young females have really low iron due to the menstrual cycle, and they have really low calcium. That's why there's these pills known as one a day women. And also, some men have a drop in the calcium. So we must ensure through blood work that we maintain our calcium level at a homeostatic range. And also the vitamin D is very important because it helps increase the absorption of calcium, to mediate the absorption of calcium from our digestive system into the circulatory system to deliver it into the tissue. So let's now talk about the very important concept of osteoclast and osteoblast. We made sure to, whenever we are describing bone tissue, we said that the bones are made up of organic, organic material and inorganic material. So the organic material happens to be the osteoid, and that is the structure of the bone, the osteoid, and that happens to be about 35% of our bone. The inorganic material is the matrix. This is the bone matrix, and it's mainly minerals, calcium and phosphate. And what gives our bone that structural strength is what's known as hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite. So if you're ever asked what gives our bone that very strong tensile strength, it's the substance known as hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite. Okay, so now let's look at um, our bone, and we have established that the bone is already rich in minerals, and we use it as a reservoir. We use it as a reservoir for we use it as a reservoir for different minerals. So, in order to understand the bone, we have to understand what cells are involved in our bone homeostasis. We said we have the osteoblasts. Osteoblasts. Um, Let me We have osteoblast. Osteoblast build up the bone. Osteoblast build up the bone, while osteoclasts degrade the bone. And the last type we talked about is known as the osteocytes. And these osteocytes, they are uh, performing surveillance activity, homeostatic surveillance to ensure that we don't have, to ensure that we have homeostatic um, bone structure. We don't want excessive bone deposition, and we do not want excessive bone degradation. So now let's look at how do osteoclasts work. So osteoclasts are very important because, as we mentioned, they degrade bone. So how do they work? So we need to understand the biochemical pathway. So what happens is there are two types of cells. We have bone marrow stromal cells, bone marrow stromal cells, and we have the osteoblast. Those two regulate for us the osteoclast activity. And what happens is the stromal cells of the bone marrow, they secrete this colony stimulating factor. This colony stimulating factor, the MCSF, you see, it comes out. So this orange cell could be one of two. Can This orange cell could either be stromal cell of the bone marrow, or it could be the osteoblast. So I'm going to begin with the stromal cell of the bone marrow pathway. So the pathway is whenever we want to degrade the bone, what happens is the stromal cell of the bone marrow will secrete the colony stimulating factor. And the colony stimulating factor, depicted in this green triangle, will bind to this yellow receptor known as the colony stimulating factor receptor, known as monocyte colony stimulating factor, MCSF. And this colony stimulating factor would bind to the receptor on the osteoclast precursor. So that's the precursor cell. That's an inactive. That is an inactive cell, inactive osteoclast. It's a precursor. So the precursor cell has the receptor for the monocyte colony stimulating factor that comes from the stromal cell of the bone marrow. And then whenever we want to activate this osteoclast to degrade the bone, that is apparently our bone here in brown and black. So that's our bone. This is our bone tissue. What happens is the monocyte colony stimulating factor would bind to the receptor of the monocyte colony stimulating factor receptor on the osteoclast precursor inactive cell. That would lead the osteoclast precursor to differentiate into an activated osteoclast. And that activated osteoclast will now go into the bone and will degrade the bone and liberate for us calcium that we need and degrade the bone. That's the first pathway. The second pathway, so that's the first pathway involving the stromal cell of the bone marrow secreting their colony stimulating factor cytokines, and they go and they differentiate for us and activate for us the osteoclast precursor inactive cells to differentiate into activated osteoclasts. That is by no means the only pathway. The other pathway is the osteoblast pathway, and that happens when the osteoblast will secrete a very important signal known as the rank ligand. So it's a rank ligand, and the rank ligand will bind the receptor the same way the monocyte colony stimulating factor that is secreted by the stromal cell has a receptor on the surface of the osteoclast precursor. The osteoblast has another receptor on the surface of the osteoclast inactive precursor cell. But that receptor is not a monocyte colony stimulating factor receptor. It is a rank receptor known as the rank receptor. So we have a rank receptor on the surface of the osteoclast precursor cell, and we have a rank ligand that is secreted by the osteoblast. When you have this binding of the osteoblast rank ligand with the osteoclast precursor inactive cell. That leads the same thing to the differentiation of the osteoclast precursor cell to differentiate into an activated osteoclast, and this activated osteoclast will now go and degrade the bone. So these are the two pathways you're responsible of knowing. How are the osteoclasts activated? They're either activated by bone marrow stromal cells secreting MCSF, and this MCSF would bind, this is a cytokine. The cytokine would bind the monocyte colony stimulating factor receptor that is found on the inactive osteoclast precursor cell, and then the inactive class precursor cell upon binding of the monocyte colony stimulating factor released by the stromal cell binding to the surface receptor of the the monocyte colony stimulating factor that leads to the differentiation and the activation of this osteoclast. The other pathway is when the osteoblast releases the rank ligand, and the rank ligand actually activates a nuclear factor kappa beta. So this pathway here, the pathway of the rank ligand binding to the rank receptor, would lead to the activation of the NF kappa beta pathway, which is a nuclear factor leading to a transcription uh, of genetic factors and transcription factors that lead to the transcription and activation of proteins that lead to the differentiation and the cell cycle activation of these osteoclast precursor cells to become activated osteoclasts. Another thing that is very important for you to understand, and that is the role of the osteoprotegrins. Osteoprotegrin, also known as OP, osteoprotegrin, osteoprotegrin. The G is the big one, OPG, osteoprotegrin, OPG. So what is osteoprotegrin? Osteoprotegrin is right here. It is secreted. It is secreted by the osteoblast. It's a decoy. So the osteoprotegrin is a decoy receptor. Is a decoy receptor that would block the binding. It is acts just like a contraceptive, just like a condom. It blocks the binding of the rank ligand to the rank receptor. It blocks. You see, it's right here. So this is the OPG. OPG. So the OPG right here is secreted by the osteoblast, and it blocks the binding of the rank ligand to the rank receptor. When you contraceptively, or when you block and you inhibit the binding of the rank ligand to the rank receptor, what happens? That means when we use the OPG, osteoprotegrin, to block the binding of the rank ligand to the rank receptor, that means we cannot initiate the NF kappa beta pathway. We cannot initiate the nuclear factor kappa beta. That means the osteoclast precursor cell will remain inactive. It will remain unable to differentiate into an activated osteoclast. So that's a very important pathway that your body utilizes whenever we have, for example, osteoporosis, or when we have an excessive calcium amount in our body. So we don't want any more degradation of bone. We don't want any more activated osteoclast. What happens is the osteoblast will now stop secreting the rank ligand, and they will secrete the OPG to block any potential binding of the rank ligand to the rank receptor. Because if that happens, that would lead to the nuclear factor kappa beta activation, leading to activation of transcription factors that lead eventually to cell cycle entry and differentiation and the proliferation of the osteoclasts that are inactive precursors into their activated form, and that will lead to more depletion and more destruction of our bone, which what we don't want. So you can tell these are pharmacological interventions. These are pharmacological interventions. So our medications for patients who are osteoporotic, these bisphosphonates, So there is a tug of war. There is a a scale, and this scale, on one side you have osteoblast, and when this side is more, that means you will have more bone buildup. On the other side you have minus, and that is osteoclast, and that is the when the osteoclasts are activated, that will lead to bone destruction. And osteoclasts favor the rank ligand. The rank ligand. So when the rank ligand binds the rank receptor, when the rank L binds rank R, rank L is a rank ligand and rank R rank receptor. When you have rank ligand binding to the rank receptor, you will have excessive osteoclast activity and destruction of bone. But when you have excessive OPG, osteoprotegerin, you would block the binding of the rank ligand to the rank receptor, and then you would have bone buildup. So when we want to treat osteoporosis, what should we tip? Should we tip the scale to the OPG side or the rank ligand, rank receptor binding side? Obviously, we need to activate more OPG. So these medications will increase OPG suppression to block the binding of rank ligand to the rank receptor and stop this nuclear kappa beta, nuclear factor kappa beta activation of the osteoclast inactive precursor, and eventually the activation of osteoclast will be stopped. So osteoproteins are very important to keep peak bone mass, while osteoclasts are important to deplete the bone mass. So these pathways are very important for us as pharmacological advancements. Also, there are other pharmacological interventions where we inhibit the binding of the monocyte colony stimulating factor to their receptor, because once that happens, when once monocyte colony stimulating factor binds to monocyte colony stimulating factor receptor, that also leads to osteoclast activity. And so when we need to block that too, when we have medications that block the binding of rank ligand to rank receptor, and all other medications that block the colony stimulating factor to its receptor. Also, remember that this is released in terms of inflammation. When there's an inflammation, these are cytokines during times of inflammation. So it's very important. Last thing that we want to discuss now is the very important concept of peak bone mass. So now we will discuss peak bone mass as we grow up. Since uh, when we grow up, we begin by having we begin by having a seemingly high, up until we are 30 years old. What happens is our peak bone mass happens to be building up until the fourth decade of our life. So the fourth decade, up until the fourth decade of um, our life, we begin building our peak bone mass. But after the so our peak bone mass is at its maximal capacity. Is at its maximal capacity. The peak bone mass is at its maximal capacity when we are in our early adulthood. So that means our peak bone mass increases due to the activity of our osteoblast. Then, so we build up our peak bone mass due to, so there's like a shaped curve. So osteoblasts are working up until, so let's say that's our age, and that's our peak, that's our bone mass. So on the y-axis you have the bone mass, and on our x-axis you have the age. So up until we are 30 years old, the osteoblasts are working to build up the bone. After 30, So here you have more osteoblast plus osteoblast, and the osteoclast are inactivated. After 30, osteoblasts become weaker and osteoblasts become weaker and osteoclasts start working, degrading our bone up until the later age of 70 to 75. So let's look at the factors that increase peak bone mass. We said that physical activity, especially bone activity that stimulates the bone to keep up with stress. So weightlifters compared to marathon runners, weightlifters have much more stronger bones because their bones now have to adapt to the stress, the mechanical stress of having to lift and pull very heavy objects. But advantages, but and also their bone does get stronger, but not as much as those who lift weights, because here the stress, for example, of running on the treadmill or doing bicycle cycles. So here we're comparing load strength to load cycles. Load strength obviously stimulates the bone density to peak and increase and remain at a high level despite the counter activity of the osteoclast. But the cycles of bicycle and running, what happens is they tend to train you, increase your endurance, and on your heart rate, give you a lower heart rate, and other very important advantages in burning fats and all of that. But they do not make your peak bone mass increase, at least not as much as the resistance exercise. So physical activity is very important. They ran experiments where you have patients, where you have rats and rats that are suspended and their by their legs, and they cannot move their legs, while other rats are running on cycle, and they saw that after a week that the bone mass of the rats that are not stimulated and that are suspended gotten weaker. So exercise is very important. Genetic factors, we said, there are congenital diseases that lead to excessive activity of genes that initiate the activity of premature osteoclast activity. We have also another problem, that where we have excessive osteoblast. So we don't want excessive osteoclast activity, and we don't want excessive osteoblast activity. We want moderation. We want steady state and homeostasis. But unfortunately, genetic factors lead to this susceptibility of excessive osteoclast activity and excessive osteoblast activity. Nutrition is very important because malnutrition in areas where there is famine or poverty and there is a lack of access to nutritious food, well, what happens is, the bone cannot be built up, and there is a lack of calcium, there is a lack of vitamin D, so there is a lack of the absorption of calcium. So it's very important to monitor that. And when it comes to nutrition, also obesity is at the other side of the spectrum. People think it's just malnutrition that deteriorates bone mass. Actually, obesity deteriorates bone mass as well, where patients who have BMIs that put them in the scale of morbid obesity type 2 or 3 and going up, that actually could put so much strain on their bones that lead to fractures and that lead to arthritis. So our peak bone mass is achieved in early into our the beginning of our fourth decade, and then they begin to deteriorate. Okay, another thing that is very important, that is females. Females have the hormone estrogen. Same thing with males, have the hormone testosterone. Testosterone and estrogen are excellent for bone mass. So males who have testosterone, high testosterone, due to their exercise, not due to exogenous testosterone that is taken in their exogenous testosterone, because that would do a bi-loop inhibition, would inhibit the secretion of FSH and LH from their pituitary, and that will inhibit GnRH from their hypothalamus. So that leads to very big problems. This is exogenous. We're talking about endogenous testosterone that is stimulated by exercise. Um, Exercise leads to strong bone mass and also osteoporosis. They did an experiment where they injected female rats with estrogen, and they saw that the rats that received high amounts of estrogen, they actually were able to reverse osteoporosis, and they developed strong bone mass when they did the DEXA scan of the bones of these rats. But obviously, when they gave the rats excessive estrogen, the rats developed cancer. So excessive, so this have to be very careful with estrogen therapy because that leads to um, breast cancer and overt expression of these herb receptors. And this is her new receptors, and that's very dangerous. So we always want to be natural in increasing the amount of our sex hormones. But for females, due to menopause, I mean, females um, um, are at a fate or a destiny known as the menopause, where men do not have this problem, at least not as much as it is with females. I mean, the sexual reproduction and sexual hormones to females by the age of 40 to 45, there is a severe drop in estrogen. So with the drop of estrogen, there is a drop in bone mass as well. So what happens in menopause, there is a decreased serum estrogen, and that lowers the peak bone mass. There is also, and that drop in estrogen is actually a state of inflammation. So when estrogen drops, that leads to the triggering and the turning from off to an on to an inflammatory state in the body of the female who is undergoing menopause. What happens is there is an increased interleukin 1 and interleukin 6 and TNF levels, inducing an overt state of inflammation, and that leads to increased expression of the rank ligand binding to the rank receptor right here. So this would happen in females who are at menopause. So what happens is the rank ligand will be expressed, and the rank ligand will bind to the rank receptor on the surface of the osteoclast inactive precursor cell, and that will lead to the activation of the NF kappa beta nuclear factor nuclear factor signal that would initiate the transcription of proteins that induce the differentiation, the proliferation of osteoclasts to enter the cell cycle and proliferate into activated osteoclasts, and that would deplete and destroy and resorb the bone. And lastly, we have increased osteoclast activity, the severe increase in osteoclast activity leading eventually to osteoporosis. So this is known as menopausal osteoporosis. Menopausal osteoporosis due to all of these activities, all of these factors caused by a severe drop in estrogen. You can say the same for males, but as males, they do not have menopausal osteoporosis. They have senile osteoporosis. Senile osteoporosis. And senile osteoporosis is associated with aging. And what happens as when men age, what happens is there is a decreased replicative activity of the osteoprogenitor cells. So these osteoblasts are now deranged due to the old age and the mutation, and there is no more telomerase. There's a drop in telomerase activity, and the telomeres are shortened with each successive round of replication, and that leads to eventually to a drop in the replicative activity of the osteoprogenitor cells. So we cannot have osteoblastic activity as efficiently as in young age, and then that leads to a decreased synthetic activity of osteoblasts. So osteoblasts are not able to perform their physiological functions with full capacity, and then that eventually leads to decreased biological activity of the matrix bound growth factors. So these growth factors now they cannot help the buildup of bones, and that leads to reduced physical activities because the bone is in a state of inflammation, and there's pain and there's swelling and there's weakness that triggers these senile old age men to favor a sedentary lifestyle, and that leads to osteoporosis in the end. Um, I hope this gave you a very good introduction into this very important concept of our musculoskeletal system structure and function, and how these osteoclasts and osteoblasts are maintaining for us our bone homeostasis. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next video.